Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, once again a warm welcome to the Tourism Students Festival 2020, organized by New Tourism Foundation, the first ever initiative at the national level to focus on education sector on tourism, bringing students in academia into an interface with the industry and the government, with a view to prepare for the challenges for the new normal. And on behalf of New Tourism Foundation, I extend a warm welcome to all our eminent panel members of this session. And ladies and gentlemen, now we have this very special session, the fireside chat with Dr. Harold Goodwin. Travel makes us better. It broadens our perspective. It pushes our boundary and it allows us to experience the world through a different lens. With great power also comes great responsibility. Responsible tourism is about making better places for people to live in and better places for people to visit. Responsible tourism requires that operators, hoteliers, governments, local people, and tourists take responsibility. Take action to make tourism more sustainable. Rural tourism is in any form of tourism that showcases the rural life, art, culture, and heritage at the rural locations, thereby benefiting the local community economically and socially, as well as enabling interaction between the tourists and the locals for a more enriching tourism experience. As we emerge into a new normal, our industry must evolve to promote the two, both that are sustainable and resilient in the long run. And for this fireside chat, we have with us Dr. Harold Goldwyn, who has worked with 4 continents with local communities, their governments, and the inbound and outbound tourism industry. He is an emeritus professor and responsible tourism director at the Institute of Place Management at Manchester Metropolitan University, managing director of the Responsible Tourism Partnership, and advisor to the World Travel Market on its Responsible Tourism Program at WTM London, which attracts 2,000 participants each year, and WTM Africa and Latin America and Arabian Travel Market. He chairs the panels of judges for the Herald, founded the ICRTD series of international conferences on responsible tourism in destinations in 2002. He co-chairs the conferences with the local host organization, and he's also founder director of the International Center for Responsible Tourism, which he founded in the year 2002 and which promotes the principles of the Cape Town Declaration. And ladies and gentlemen, participating in this chat is Mr. Vinod Zucchi, IAS, President New Tourism Foundation, who is now into the profession of consultancy and advisory and is based in Delhi. He is offering his services as a consultant and advisor in the field of travel, tourism, and hospitality. Is currently associated with organizations dealing with travel and tourism as an advisor. He's chairman on advisory board, New India Tourism, advisor, destination reporter, and India Travel Magazine, advisor, Experience Bharat, chairman, advisory committee for consultants, advisor to FICCI, Medical Value Travel Committee 2019, member advisory board of Foundation of Healthcare and Wellness Promotion. He is also a member of the Managing Committee, Special Invitee of National Apex Body of PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Executive Member of India Cruise Lines Association, Member Board of Trustees, Foundation for Aviation and Sustainable Tourism FAST, Honorary Member, Tourism Committee, PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Honorary President, Health Travel Council of India, member of CII National Committee on Tourism and Hospitality, and also the Honorary Member, Ecotourism Society of India. And now, ladies and gentlemen, may I request Mr. Vinod Sushi to kindly take over the proceedings of this fireside chat. Over to you, sir.
Well, good afternoon, Dr. Harold Goodwin, and welcome to the Tourism Students Festival 2020 organized by New Tourism Foundation India. I also welcome all the attendees and the viewers of this fireside chat session, which I will have with Dr. Harold Goodwin, who is our guest of the session and the key speaker on the subject responsible tourism and rural tourism, the integral part of the new normal. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Harold Goodwin is a veteran, an international expert, and an authority on responsible tourism. Although he actually does not need any introduction, however, I would like to introduce him to the young professionals and our Indian friends, although he is very well known to the Indian tourism fraternity as well. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Harold Goodwin is Emeritus Professor at Manchester Metropolitan University. He is the Director of the Responsible Tourism Partnership. He is the Founder Director of the International Center for Responsible Tourism, an advisor to World Travel Market on Responsible Tourism, Chair of the Judges for the annual World Responsible Tourism Awards, and also the Chair of the Advisory Council of Village Ways. Well, so dear students and friends, we could not have had a better speaker on the subject than Dr. Harold Goodwin today. Ladies and gentlemen, before I begin on the fireside chat session with Dr. Goodwin, let me very briefly introduce the theme of today's session. As we all know, we are focusing today on two very important areas and concepts of tourism which have global implications, namely responsible tourism and rural tourism, and both of which have become much more relevant and significant in the light of new global order arising from the COVID crisis. In fact, COVID or no COVID, these two segments have always been significant for all nations, although very little has been done on the two fronts so far till the time the COVID struck. Friends, we are all agreeable that COVID has been one of the biggest disasters for travel and tourism for the whole world, but it has certainly taught us some lessons also. And to my mind, one big lesson which the entire mankind may have learned is to be more responsible towards oneself, towards nature, and towards each other. And we all know that today also, if the entire mankind does not behave responsibly in following the health protocols like wearing of masks, social distancing, the COVID menace will be difficult to be overpowered. And therefore, responsible tourism assumes much greater significance in the new normal today than ever before. Talking about rural tourism, friends, COVID has largely affected the urban areas, the big, densely populated cities all over the world. This calls for bringing village and rural tourism to the center stage of tourism. And no wonder why UNWTO has also designated the World Tourism Day 2020 as the year of tourism and rural development. So friends, with this brief introduction, I welcome Dr. Harold Goodwin once again to the session. And Dr. Goodwin, to begin our chat, I would request you to give your opening remarks about the relevance of the topic of today's session and how, according to you, the responsible tourism and rural tourism will need greater focus in the light of new global order, in the light of new normal, and in times to come. Dr. Goodwin.
Thank you very much, Bedard, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. It is clearly the case that the young professionals need very rapidly to take control of our industry. Let me start with a reflection. In 1972, I was at the University of York studying politics, and international politics was part of that curriculum. 1972 was the first big UN conference on man and the environment, when we began to wake up to the fact that we were going to bounce up against the limits to growth in a world where human population and our consumption within it was growing very dramatically. 40 years later, of course, we get to the second Rio conference, by which point I'm virtually on the edge of retirement. I retire shortly after that. The point I want to make to the young people watching this is that in that 40 years of my working life, we heard an awful lot about the principle of sustainability and sustainable tourism, but the words were used almost without meaning, because people talked about being sustainable, meaning no more than they thought they would still be in business in the following year. So responsible tourism grew really from that origin, in the realization that we needed to challenge people to take responsibility and to stop being irresponsible. And I think that's partly been the power of it, that nobody really wants to be called irresponsible. It's a It's something we remember from the conflicts with our parents when we were described as being irresponsible. And we debated at great length with our parents all over the world in different cultures, different religious contexts and so on. We discussed what responsibility means. And I think as human beings, we all have a very clear idea of what it means, although of course we prefer not to take the responsibility and hope that someone else will solve the problems. The truth is they're not going to. And I think one of the challenges for all of us is to continue to ask that question. When people say they're being sustainable or they're taking responsibility, we need to ask them what concretely they're doing. We need to look for the evidence, and we need to reward through awards, through booking with companies, businesses, local guides who are demonstrably taking responsibility. Because if we don't take responsibility, we won't make tourism better. And that's at the heart of the idea of responsible tourism, is making better places for people to live in first, and better places for people to visit second. And I've been very pleased to see the way those ideas are now being taken up by the National Ministry and by a number of states in India. But to come to the rural tourism question, Vinod, I think we have an advantage there in the sense that rural people often don't realize how interesting their way of life is for people who have moved to cities and been urbanized. And you see that in India dramatically. Over the last 10 years, there's been such a big growth in rural tourism experiences, and people who are 1, 2, or 3 generations from living in a rural area, often taking their children back for family holidays to experience rural life, to understand where their food comes from, the importance of clean water and so on. And that growth in the experiential tourism market, which we've seen generally around the world, has really benefited the growth of rural tourism. People don't dismiss it in the way that they used to when I first started working in tourism 20 or 30 years ago. That said, of course, the vast majority of tourism is still to cities, because those are the places with the big sites and those where people want to go to get their selfie. But you look at the experience, particularly in Kerala, which is perhaps the most advanced area in India in this, the village life experiences, those things have really taken off. And I think it shows the way for people who are wanting to get back to a simpler, often a cleaner, less complicated, and more authentic experience. And that really can hardly ever be had in cities. It needs to be taken in rural areas, whether that's in the area where I live in England or in India.
Dr. Goodwin, I'll put some questions first about the responsible tourism subject. You have studied, most of the countries, globally, including India, about the execution of the mission of responsible tourism. In fact, you are taking this mission forward and also overseeing, how it is well implemented. What is your perception, like with 5 years down the line, already passed since the UN adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and 2030 agenda? We have 5 years gone, 10 years left. Now, how do you assess the progress on the SDGs, and particularly responsible tourism being part of the sustainability? How do you think the implementation and execution by all the countries globally has been satisfactory according to your perception?
I need to go back a little bit, Vinod. I'm sorry for that, but I do need to just step back a little from where we are. I think we all know as human beings that it's really hard if you're getting out of bed in the morning and you've got 30 different things to do in a day. It's quite disempowering when you've got that kind of challenge ahead of you. And there's a tendency then to procrastinate and prevaricate and probably spend longer over coffee and not actually achieve very much that day. If you get out of bed thinking, I want to do 3 things today, and I'm going to do this one in the morning, I'm going to do that at lunchtime, I'm going to do that in the afternoon, it's a much better chance of getting it done. Now, the reason I say all this is that my concern about the Sustainable Development Goals is that there are so many of them and so many targets that actually they can be really quite disempowering. And if you feel disempowered and you lack focus, then it's very difficult to take action and to get things done. So I think that the fundamental thing we need to recognize is that for human beings to achieve progress, they need focus, and they need to make connections with other people around a limited number of things and get them done. The challenge then is to think, well, what am I going to do where I am? Now, let me give two examples about this as the problem. The first problem is that there are a couple of issues which are genuinely global. One is plastic pollution and the other is air pollution, particularly carbon emissions. Those things may well happen somewhere up the Ganges, but the plastic that goes into the Ganges may well end up, I don't know, in the South Pacific in the gyro of pollution there, because that's a problem. The second problem is obviously air pollution, and anything which I emit here goes into the atmosphere, it affects all of us. Those things are really hard to deal with locally. But most issues are local in the sense that they can be dealt with locally. And let me give the example of water in the UK. As you'll know, Vinod, we have an awful lot of water, and I worked in Manchester for many years, and it rained a lot. My sister lives in North Wales. They have a big problem with water. They have too much of it. She floods. I live in Kent, where we have roughly the same rainfall as Israel. We don't have enough. So that for a hotel in North Wales to focus on reducing its water consumption is probably a lot less important than creating employment. Where I'm in Kent with high levels of employment and very low unemployment, water is the critical issue. And part of the problem, I think, is to get people to focus on what matters locally and to partner with local communities through local government, whether that's a city government, a rural government, a panchayat in India, or a national park authority, to focus at that local level to make the change which will make a difference to local people's lives. And if we do that, then we will meet the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think the problem is to empower people at the very local level, Vinod, to actually take the actions which are required. And as I say, there are only really two global issues. Water is not a global issue. It's an issue which occurs in lots of places around the world, but it's not in any normal sense of that word a global issue.
Well, there's a very pertinent point that since the issue is more of local, it will be easier for countries to handle, and it is the local administration, the local community, which should become more responsible to handle their issues.
If I could just add to that with a specific India example, I think that's why the way responsible tourism started in Kerala is so interesting, because it started with 4 experiments at the panchayat level. So they worked with 4 different ones to try and work out what would work. And having had the experiment and found the one that really worked well, which as we know is Kumarakoram, they then rolled that out across the state. And it seems to me we need more of that kind of very practical approach to making change at the local level.
Dr. Goodwin, you very rightly mentioned about the pollution level and all. In the last 9 months of COVID pandemic, Dr. Goodwin, we have all seen that mankind has behaved much more responsibly than ever before. Everywhere in the world, including India, we have heard about air and water pollution level going drastically down, the clearer air and better natural environment all over. But by and large, this behavior of responsibility that we have seen in the last 9 months, to my mind, has been driven by the fear of life and health and the fear of law and authority. So what do you think, in the light of the experience that we have had, the whole world has had, do you think that it's time that nations and governments need to regulate, to have legal provisions, to have punishment clauses, and impose fear of authority to bring in responsible behavior?
Yes and no. Again, a long answer, Vinod, and I apologize for this. I think what's happened in Venice is particularly interesting in this regard. And unfortunately, and rather sadly, I'm not going to get to go to India at all this year. I was there in January. I'm not going to get there again. And I don't know about next year. But my sense of what's happening is it's fairly common around the world. People have seen in Venice, it's very acute, a seriously overvisited heart of an ancient city. And they've seen the fish come back, the rivers clear. They've had the pleasure of enjoying Venice without it being swamped by tourists. I think people have seen that there is an alternative. And one of the problems about the growth of tourism has been the frog effect. You know, the old story that if you drop a frog into cold water and just heat it slowly, the frog will eventually be killed. It won't jump out because it doesn't realize what's happening to it. And that's what's happened. Now, of course, we've seen a stop to that kind of mass tourism, and people have seen the alternative. And that will be true all over the world in every destination. It's certainly true in London. So the question of how do we go forward from here, I think people, and this goes back to Krippendorf, who really is the father of responsible tourism. He talked about the ethic of responsibility, that people actually will do things because they feel good if they've done those things. Now, having said that, and I think that is generally true of human beings, most of us want to be seen well by other people around us. We want our friends and relatives, our neighbors, the people we're with in the street to see us as responsible human beings, as good human beings. We want to be reflected well. Having said that, there's always a group who rebel against that, who do not want to comply. And to some extent, you can use normative social pressure to control that behavior. But I think in the US in particular, we've seen, and to some extent in Germany with the protests there, and in London with the anti-control protests which have taken place against the wearing of masks. There's a minority of people who do need, to some degree, to be coerced on behalf of the others. Because the reason we wear the mask is not to protect ourselves, because it does not effective at that. We wear it to protect others. And that is a real act, I think, of social responsibility to wear the mask. So what I would say is I think we can rely to a very large extent on people's desire to be responsible. And at the same time, we're going to need to coerce those few people who consistently break the rules and endanger other people.
Dr. Goodwin, that brings me to the point that if not the fear, or if not the fear of law to be brought in at this stage, people have already experienced that if you tinker with nature, something worse will happen, and it should be a good lesson for the entire mankind. But at the same time, we've had one advantage also, that at one point of time, maybe before COVID struck, we used to talk about bringing in public awareness about responsible tourism, about sustainable tourism. Now, COVID has done that job of bringing an awareness all over the world without the government, without anyone intervening, without spending money on promotion and all. Now, this has been one advantage. Now, at the same time, in the pre-COVID days, Dr. Goodwin, you chair the Responsible Tourism Awards also at WTM. I was also privileged to attend that award function. Now, do you think that incentivization in some manner by the nations, by the governments, will that be one of the solutions, or maybe one of the action points? Like public awareness could be one, incentivization could be another, and partial fear could be the third resort, maybe in order to control certain specific issues. So you think incentivization, and the way you have done in terms of RT awards and all, what impact this kind of awarding and incentivization and recognition has helped to bring in responsible tourism globally, Dr. Goodwin?
I think that for any business, the major incentive is always the way that the market moves. And we are seeing the growth of, I think, of two, if you like, social movements which have their expression across consumption in general, and therefore across tourism as well. One is the sense of wanting more authentic experiences, which takes people closer to the communities that they're visiting than was the case when my parents were traveling 30 years ago. So that pursuit of authenticity, that pursuit of the backstage, that pursuit of closer encounters with local communities, and the growth of the experiential tourism has predisposed people to want something which is more responsible. And the second part of that is the growth in awareness of environmental and social impacts which have come through, for example, the Black Lives Matters movement, and we're dealing with tourism and racism at WTM this year for the first time because of that coming to the fore. And I have to say, we've had some great contributions from India to that debate, as you would expect, frankly. So I think we are seeing a shift in consumer demand, but the reality is that those people who are the leaders in responsible tourism can go so far, but no further, because they need to compete with people who are perhaps being totally irresponsible. So if you take, for example, the problem with the airlines, it is impossible for me to get to India, really, realistically. I could come overland and take a boat, I guess, but the reality is that I don't have the time to do that. So in reality, I have to fly. And I'm not, at the moment, there is no choice, because the aviation industry just sits there quietly saying, there is no alternative. We will reduce carbon a little bit and you can buy carbon offsets, but actually we're not going to do anything. Now, I don't think aviation will be changed without government regulation. And I think there are some parts of the sustainability agenda which can only be achieved by ruthless government intervention. And we've seen what's happened with cars. You know, governments announced that they would no longer permit the selling of cars which run on dirty fuel. And there's a timetable and there's regulation and the legislation is in place. And what happens? The car industry responds. And I'm afraid that there are parts of travel and tourism which are going to have to be dealt with by regulation in the same way. So I think it's a mix. And it's, again, it comes back, Vinod, to saying, what's the issue? How do we solve it? And in some cases, you do it through social pressure. In other cases, you're going to have to do it through regulation, and often by a mix. But it is, again, about the specifics and not the generalities.
I think you have a very valid point, and depends from nation to nation, government to government, people to people. Like you mentioned about the car. Let me tell you, Delhi government tried, last year, during November, December, Delhi gets a lot of, air pollution. So the government tried this odd even formula, that odd number cars will fly on one day and the even. I mean, it did bring some result, but the actual logistics, the handling of the entire thing, became an issue. And then, of course, it could not continue and sustain, but then an attempt was made. At least it has come to the people's knowledge. Dr. Goodwin, before I...
No, sorry, can I just come back on that? Do you mind? Because I'm actually very impressed by what Delhi's done. And I think for any administration to act in the way Delhi has at the whole city level is both brave and principled. But you're not going to get it right the first time. And I think we need to cut some slack for people to have these experiments. I mean, what's been done with the old, they're called tuk-tuks in Indonesia. I forget what they're called in India, but the small little vehicles, which are now all running on much cleaner fuels. The efforts in Delhi, as I see it, and from afar, have been rather undermined by the burning of crops around Delhi and the wind blowing those gases in. So, we have to experiment, we have to learn how to do it better, and we need to applaud people who have experiments, even if it doesn't work, because then others can learn from those experiments and do better next time. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm quite passionate about Delhi. I think they've done some really good work.
Dr. Goodwin, you know so much about India. I mean, I'm so happy about it. In fact, just to update you, the government since last year has been trying to take this stubble, the crop stubble, right from the fields and use it as a raw material for industry. So that would mean you don't have to burn it. Now, this will be, I would say, a very revolutionary step in containing.
It would increase the livelihoods of the farmers.
Yeah.
It's a real plus situation. I'd heard about that. I hope it works. But again, until you actually experiment with it, you will never know whether it's going to work or not. But the important thing is to keep trying and keep experimenting.
So before I come to rural tourism and spend 5 minutes with you, just the last question on responsible tourism. What will be your advice, just one or two advices for each of these, or your tips in the light of new normal towards being responsible for the government, for the tourism industry, for the community, and for the traveler?
I think one of the critical things is for people to learn to work together, and for governments and industry, for example, with local communities represented through the Panchayat, to talk about what are the local issues and how they can be addressed by the different parties to that, working together. I don't think the guides at the moment play enough of a role. The guides, the concierges, the people engaging directly with the tourists also have something to contribute in this regard. But it is always about partnerships at the local level. For the plastics and the air pollution, I think there has to be national level action backed up then by international conventions. And even if you look at the United States of America, and let's not discuss that for long, Vinod, but the reality is that we have one image of the USA through the presidential and federal powers. But if you look at what's happening at the city level, massive progress is being made in America. Despite what's happening at the federal level, cities are moving rapidly, and they are moving towards a much more sustainable future. So I think it is a matter of us choosing to work with the progressive administrations at whatever level, whether that's to the panchayat or the national ministry or the state government, or in America, whether it's the federal structures, the state structures, or the cities.
Dr. Goodwin, coming to rural tourism, I was just wondering why UNWTO, in the midst of COVID crisis, when the entire travel and tourism fraternity is being, badly affected, at this point of time, if they have designated the coming year as the year of tourism for rural development, what, according to you, is in the mind of UNWTO, and what does it want to convey to the world in the light of the new normal? You think rural tourism has a distinct edge in times to come in the light of COVID?
Yeah, I don't know why UNWTO has done this. I think I really don't know. It may be that they were simply looking for an area where there could be some positive messages rather than the negativity, which is otherwise around the industry. And clearly one of the problems for travel and tourism, and we can't duck this, Vinod, it is a big issue, is that with a problem like COVID, we have to accept the fact that we've spread it. It is the act of people moving between countries and between different parts of nations which has spread the virus. When I remember as a child going to visit a village in North Derbyshire called Eyam, where they decided they had an outbreak of the plague, and they decided that they would quarantine themselves, and nobody moved in or out of that village for a long time. A lot of them died, but a lot of other people outside the village were not hit by the plague. We're not capable of that today, I don't think. But it was an act of social heroism of the first order. And I remember as a child being massively impressed by that and hoping that I would never be asked to make that choice, because you don't want to have to face that. But I think that there are two things. One, the optimism of what's possible in rural areas, and secondly, the realization that the benefits of tourism need to be spread. So for example, if I use Village Ways as an example, the whole idea behind that was to try to generate economic growth and development in villages so that rural depopulation would cease. And when I worked in Slovenia, it was the same issue. Time after time, I'd do the workshop, and as we were leaving, an old lady at the back, it was nearly always an old lady, would grab hold of the interpreter and get him to say thank you for stopping their children leaving the villages. Because by creating opportunities for people to meet with international visitors or people from elsewhere in their own country in rural areas, you reduce the propensity, the desire of young people to leave rural areas. And if all young people leave rural areas, there will be no living life in those villages. And I think all countries go through the same process. People turn their backs on rural life, and then suddenly it becomes really attractive. 2 and 3 generations from having left that rural background, people want to rediscover the way they used to live. I remember in Saudi Arabia when I was privileged to do interviews with the sons, it was only the sons of the elite in Saudi Arabia. And one of the things that came through really powerfully was their desire to meet with the Bedouin and to understand where their families had come from within the Bedouin tradition of living in the desert. Now, they were a couple of generations from that, and their parents had been glad to leave it. But for those children to understand where they'd come from meant that they needed to get back in touch with the Bedouin. Not that they wanted to become Bedouin again, but they wanted to understand that. And they wanted to meet with people who were still leading that kind of life as they knew their ancestors had done.
And Dr. Goodwin, you know India so well. India, rural tourism is a distinct USP of India. And if we are able to bring in some good infrastructure connectivity, and of course, other amenities and facilities for these rural destinations, I think it will be a win-win situation. Also because, as you have mentioned, Dr. Goodwin, that most of the destinations, the sites, tourism sites are located in urban areas, maybe in other parts of the world. But India has a distinction of having these sites, most of them, the archaeological sites, the heritage monuments, more on the rural side rather than in the urban areas, except maybe Taj Mahal and Red Fort and all. So India has a distinct advantage. So you think that in order to bring in rural tourism into India and maybe develop it faster, we need to spend a lot of money on infrastructure, or you think that whatever is the situation today, we need to promote tourism in the status quo, like whatever amenities, facilities in the raw condition, instead of making hotels and developing accommodation? What do you think would the people like to have? Otherwise, we'll build another urban, destination in a rural area. So, will you recommend for a natural way of enjoying and experiencing rural tourism as it is, or maybe developing into another urban conglomerate?
Bernard, you always ask long questions which require long answers.
Sorry, just
First, no, don't apologize. They're good questions. They're very good questions. Let me first say I hardly know India at all. I've been a lot, but I look at India and I think there's so much of this great country I'm never going to see, and I get depressed about that because I've never been dissatisfied wherever I've been in India. I've always had the most fascinating trip, and I think it's true. If I knew I had one last trip in my life and I was still fit enough to do it, I can tell you pretty accurately where I would go in India. I have it planned. So India is really important to me. Let's be very clear about that. But it's important because life is still lived on the street. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. But, I think of the amount of I've understood of Indian culture just from walking down the street and seeing the way people lead their lives within a cultural tradition. And those cultural traditions are very different in different parts of India. It's no accident that you work with the strapline Incredible India. The diversity of India is incredible. And I laugh when people tell me they're going to India on holiday. I just think that's just madness. You can't go to India. You can go to part of India, but you can't go to India. India is not one place. It's one nation. It's one state, but the diversity is immense. And you can, of course, see that diversity much more clearly in rural areas than you can see it in cities, because cities are always more cosmopolitan, more of a melting pot, more difficult to see those living cultures. And as we get more interested as travelers in that living culture, I think rural areas come to the fore. Now, the question of how it should be developed, I think, is really important. You put your finger right on the problem. Because if we go for big developments, two things happen. One, those cease to be rural areas. They will become peri-urban or urban areas, highly undesirable because you destroy the attraction in that way. And secondly, you're creating yet more dependency on tourism. And the one thing we should have learned from COVID, and there will be more pandemics of this kind, it's quite clear. The World Health Organization, the World Bank, evidence is overwhelming in this. There will be others. We can't deny that. We need to be prepared better for the next time it happens. And one of the critical things about resilience is not being over-dependent on any one way of making a living. One of the things I've learned from working with the economically poor through the work I've done on local economic development is how savvy they are about, at the household level, having a series of different income streams and not being dependent just on one job. And you see that now in the UK. The people who've got nice jobs who are now being made redundant are in a real quandary because they don't have any other way of making a living. Whereas if you're economically poor, you will generally within the household have a significant number of different ways that you make a living. So I think creating dependency is something we need to work against in tourism, so that tourism becomes an additional source of livelihood, an additional market, but not the only one. And you see that really strongly in rural tourism with homestays, guest houses, the arts and crafts, where people are making things which they would ordinarily sell locally, but they make them slightly differently to sell to tourists. That's fine. They're not becoming dependent on tourism. Tourism is an additional livelihood, not a replacement. And I think we need to watch that really carefully, in terms of the policy and the government strategies. We should not increase dependency on tourism, because we've just had a real object lesson in why that's a disaster.
Very true. Dr. Goodwin, we are running out of time. My last request to you, what is your brief message, a two-liner that you would like to give to the young students and young professionals to rebuild their confidence after this COVID crisis?
It's extremely difficult to predict the future. I would like to offer a personal and a collective apology for how little my generation achieved. I look back now on a 40-year working life. I'm still working, but 40 years of employed. I'm no longer employed. 40 years of employment, all of it around political education and sustainability. We've learned an awful lot about how not to do it. Your generation is really important. I wish you well, and if I can do anything to help you by telling you what doesn't work and enabling you to build on my experience and to do it better, please just ask. But I have every confidence that your generation will make the difference, and all power to your elbow. And really thank you, Vinod, for the opportunity to talk to this group of people. They are the future, and I wish them well.
Thanks, Dr. Harold Goodwin. Thank you so much. Let me once again extend my thanks and gratitude to you on my own behalf, on behalf of the New Tourism Foundation, of which I am incidentally the president, and also on behalf of the entire Indian tourism fraternity for sparing your valuable time today. Thanks very much, Dr. Goodwin. And thanks to the listeners, to the viewers, to the students and young professionals. Thank you very much. With this, we close this session. And thank you, Dr. Goodwin, once again. Hope to meet you soon in some other forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Vinod.
Thank you.
Vinod, before you disappear, can I just have, you can cut this out, obviously, of the recording. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate being invited to do this. And this is a very bad time for me because I've got all the pressure of the virtual WTM, which is why I'm so stressed, and I apologize for that. But once that's over, you know, please feel free to involve me in what you're doing with the New Tourism Foundation. I'm really keen on what you're doing, and I am keen to see responsible tourism grow in India. I wanted just to say a couple of things to you. I've got a little bit of time. Next year, in 2021, the main focus for WTM will be on celebrating what's been achieved in responsible tourism in each of the areas where we have a travel show. And in 2022, it'll be the 20th anniversary of the Cape Town Declaration. So there'll be a big event at WTM London, and hopefully by then we will have a normal trade show again. Who knows? It really depends whether we get COVID under control. But that 20th anniversary is really important. And what seems to me to be highly likely now, because I think I do have a grasp of what's happening around the world in responsible tourism, is that India will have very significantly developed responsible tourism in Kerala, in Madhya Pradesh, possibly in Maharashtra, and certainly lots of private sector examples that we've recognised through the awards. And I'm hopeful that the new national tourism policy will go through with its commitments to responsible tourism. Now, the logic of all that is that India will be the lead place for responsible tourism in 2022. And therefore take the lead role in WTM in 2022. And I'm really keen that we use that, Vinod, both to celebrate what's been achieved, but also to energize young people around the world to take up these approaches, because I think we have demonstrated that they work. And, you know, in the end, people change the world a little bit at a time. I mean, the person I run, or used to run, I don't have time anymore, People and Places, the volunteering company with, who's a lady, constantly says, how does a lady eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. But what we need, of course, are lots of people doing those bites in lots of different communities all over India. So I think your initiative is really important. And as I said at the beginning of this, as it were, after interview bit, anything I can do to help, Vinod, I'm really keen. One of the things I suppose about being old, and you probably feel this as well, is that it's time to pass the torch and to create those young leaders in the next generation. And my goodness, they need to do better than you and I did. You know, we just did not make enough progress in our lives, and they need to accelerate it. So please ask. I'm really happy to help.
I will stay in touch, and we'll update you on our activities in New Tourism Foundation. And thanks for updating me about the future events and agenda of responsible tourism. I personally and the New Tourism Foundation, on behalf of organization, would be very keen to be actively associated. In fact, today we are having, sessions with the Joint Secretary of Ministry of Tourism, who is framed the new National Tourism Policy 2020. You will be surprised that you don't have to wait till 2022. The next session which I'm going to have is to discuss the draft new tourism policy. If you wish, I can send it across to your mail.
No, I've seen it. I've studied it well. What I wanted to say to you, though, Vinod, is I am struggling to get somebody from the National Ministry to be on the panel at WTM. I'm going to very quickly now send you the panel and ask you to ask that person whether they would be on the panel.
I would recommend the concerned person who is dealing with this subject. In fact, he's one of the keynote speaker in my next session starting in another hour. He's the Joint Secretary who has come in place of Mr. Suman Billa. His name is Rakesh Kumar Verma. I'll send his credentials and other things to you.
Please do. I will send this brief to you so that you know what I'm talking about. And if you could just get into, I will then write formally to him, but please send me his email address. But I will quickly now, before my next interview, which interestingly is with Talib Rafai.
Thank you.
Who you probably know well.
For the time. Thank you.
Thankful to all our eminent panelists for their insightful and thoughtful addresses, and also to the viewers of this session. I'm sure that the takeaways of the session will enthuse confidence among students and young professionals during the current testing times towards the new normal. We have a surprise for you all attendees. Scan the QR code on your screens with your mobile phones and answer 10 questions in 10 minutes. You will get to win prizes and surprise gifts. And I shall see you in the next session.